They gave her 14 minutes. That was how long it took from the moment Nkechi Adeyemi Bright stepped into the office of the Deputy Director of Human Resources at 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, to the moment she stepped back out with a manila envelope in her hand and nothing in the room she had occupied for 22 years and 4 months still belonging to her. 14 minutes. She knew because the clock above the door in that office was the same clock that had been there since 2011, the one with the second hand that skipped. It always skipped, jumping from 47 to 49 without touching 48. And she had watched it complete 14 full laps while the deputy director, a man named Gerald Ease, who had been with the company for 11 months, from a sheet of paper in a voice calibrated to sound regretful without actually being it. Restructuring. That was the word he used. And then redundancy. And then, we appreciate your years of service. He did not look at her once while he said it. He looked at the sheet of paper. Outside the glass partition behind his head, she could see the open-plan floor where 53 people sat at their desks. Some of them were watching. She could tell by the angle of the heads. She could tell by who stopped typing. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She set her visitor badge on his desk. She had been given a visitor badge for this meeting, as though 22 years had dissolved overnight and she was now simply a person who had come in from the street. And she said, "I understand." She took the manila envelope and she walked out. Nkechi Odinaka Adeyemi Bright was 51 years old, 5 feet 4, 141 pounds. She had worn her hair in the same two-strand twist pinned at the nape of her neck every working day for 9 years, which was when she had decided to stop spending her Thursday evenings doing something that hurt in order to approximate a version of herself she had chosen. She was wearing a navy blue shift dress that she had paid 200 naira for at a seamstress near her house in 2017 and had it taken in once since then, in 2022, when the weight she had lost during the 6 months of her mother's illness did not come back. The dress was clean, the dress was pressed. On her right wrist, she wore a thin copper bracelet her mother had given her in 1998 when she got her first job offer, for luck and for keeping. Her mother had said, placing it on her wrist the way you place a promise. She had not taken it off in 26 years. She had been a senior records and documentation analyst at Meridian Capital Partners, one of the largest private investment firms in Lagos, since 2002. When she arrived, the records department had 3 people, a shared computer, filing system that had been designed by a man who no longer worked there, and that no one who currently worked there fully understood. She was 29 years old, and she understood it in 3 weeks. In the first year, she restructured the entire archive. 16 years of transaction records, regulatory filings, client correspondence, compliance documentation, into a system she built herself by hand, a series of green-covered ledgers that she backed up onto disk and onto paper and stored in 2 separate locations because she had learned from her father, who had been a records clerk for a municipal government for 34 years. The only document worth keeping is the one that still exists when everything else is gone. She had never missed a day of work due to illness. She had not taken a personal day that was not pre-approved 4 weeks in advance. She had trained 14 junior analysts in that department, 7 of whom had since been promoted out of records and into other divisions of the firm. She had twice been formally passed over for the head of documentation role. Once in 2010, when it went to a man with 8 years less experience, once in 2016, when it went to a woman who left the firm after 19 months. After the second time, Nkechi had not applied again. She had simply continued doing the work. She had not been given a reason for why she was passed over either time. She had asked politely, both times. Both times she was told there were multiple strong candidates and the decision had been difficult. She had written the responses in her personal notebook, a black rhodia she kept in the top drawer of her desk, not out of bitterness, but because she believed in keeping records. Her father had taught her that too. If it matters, write it down. If you write it down, you can look at it clearly. If you can look at it clearly, it cannot be used against you by anyone who prefers it to be blurry. She stood in the elevator with the manila envelope and her visitor badge gone, and the copper bracelet warm on her wrist, and she thought, 22 years. She pressed the lobby button. The elevator went down. She did not go to her desk first. She went to the archive. The archive occupied the entire basement level of the Meridian Capital Partners building on Bordeaux Road in Lagos. Was a room Nkechi had designed herself in 2005 when the firm outgrew the original record space on the 4th floor. She had written the proposal, selected the shelving contractor, specified the humidity controls, and managed the 3-month migration of 15 years of accumulated documentation into the new space without losing a single file. The room smelled of paper and something faintly metallic from the shelving, a smell she had breathed in every working day for 22 years. She knew it the way you know the smell of a house where you grew up. She walked through the rows to the far end, Section G, Shelf 4. She crouched down and pulled out a gray box file. The label on the spine read, Compliance, Regulatory Audit Trail, 2004 to 2009, Adeyemi Bright Series. The label was in her own handwriting. The same handwriting that was on every label in this room. The same black marker, the same size, because consistency was the first principle of any system that had to be read by someone other than the person who made it. She set the box on the reading table in the center of the room and opened it. Inside, 43 individual folders labeled by date, each containing the original transaction documentation for the firm's offshore capital movement filings in the period specified. She had organized them. She had cataloged them. She had between March 2007 and November 2008, when the then head of compliance had asked her to run secondary checks on several flagged accounts, cross-referenced them by hand against the central bank regulatory registers, and found 11 discrepancies that the primary system had missed. She had spent 63 working hours on that cross-reference, tracked in her Rhodia notebook to the minute, because if you are going to tell someone that their records are wrong, you need to be able to show them exactly how wrong, and for exactly how long. She had reported the discrepancies through the proper internal channel. She had been told by the then managing director the matter was being handled. She had asked for confirmation in writing. She had received instead a verbal thank you and a 2.0 Naira gift voucher at the year-end review. She had kept copies, not the originals. She had never taken originals. She had photographed every document with the digital camera she bought in 2006 specifically for this purpose. A Canon PowerShot that cost her 31 Naira, and which she still kept charged. At home in its original case, out of a habit that was closer to principle than to caution. She had printed the photographs, placed them in sealed envelopes, dated and signed in her own hand, stored them in a bank deposit box she rented for 8,500 Naira per year at Garanti Trust Bank on Victoria Island. She had also kept her own handwritten cross-reference ledger, the full record of what she had found, when she had found it, who she had told, what they had said back, and what the regulatory register showed against each discrepancy. 22 pages of it in her precise, unhurried hand. The last entry was dated November 14, 2008. Below it she had written, in the same measured script, matter closed per verbal communication. No written confirmation provided. File retained. The box on the archive table did not contain those records. Those were off-site, had been since 2008, because a person who keeps records understands that the records most likely to disappear are the ones that are inconvenient to the people who control the space they are kept in. But the box contained something else. It contained the internal routing sheet, a single landscape format document clipped to the inside cover of each folder, stamped with the dates and initials of every person who had handled that file from origination through secondary review through final classification. She turned to routing sheet 11. She had looked at it before. 11 months ago, the afternoon Gerald Easy sent his introductory email to staff. The afternoon something had moved in the back of her mind like a boat shifting on still water. She looked at it again now. Column 4. Secondary review. Date June 2008. Initials. GAE Gerald Adewale Eze, according to his own LinkedIn profile, which she had read 11 months ago, quietly in her lunch hour, had been a junior compliance associate at Fidelity Asset Management in 2008. Not at Meridian, at Fidelity. His initials were here, on a routing sheet, in a secondary review column, inside a file that bore the classification stamp of this firm. He had not mentioned in his introductory email. He had not mentioned it in the 11 months since. He had sat across from her this morning and read from a sheet of paper, in a voice calibrated to sound regretful, and he had not once looked at her face. She understood. She had understood since November. She had simply waited and done her work and kept her records in 2 separate locations, prepared a document that would outlast her presence in the building, and let the morning arrive in its own time. She replaced the box file on shelf 4. She straightened the label so it was flush with the edge of the shelf. She turned off the archive light and walked back up the stairs. If this story is already doing something to your chest, subscribe now. Because what she does next is the thing that nobody in that building expected. And it is the thing you will not forget. Her desk, she had one plant, a small pothos in a terracotta pot she had painted herself in 2014 at a community arts weekend her daughter had dragged her to. Her daughter Chidinma's name was scratched into the base of the pot, 4 years old at the time, writing her own name for the first time in a medium she had not been told she could use. Nkechi packed the pothos. She packed the Rhodia notebook, the current one, which was her 11th. She packed the small framed photograph of her parents taken in 1986 in Enugu, her mother in a green and gold lace blouse, her father in a white agbada, both of them laughing at something behind the camera. She packed the copper bracelet spare. She kept a second one, same make, in the desk for the days she forgot to wear the one on her wrist, which in 22 years had happened 4 times. She did not take the green ledgers. They were company property. She left them on the shelf in the correct order, labeled as they had always been. She took her bag. She paused for exactly 1 moment at her desk. Then she walked to the center of the open-plan floor, not to the elevator, to the stairs, but to the center, where the communal meeting tables were, and she set her bag down on one of the tables, and she opened her laptop. She had prepared this in October of the previous year, actually, not knowing then that she would need it. She had prepared it simply because she was the kind of person who prepared things. She had spent 4 Sundays writing it. She opened the file now and turned the laptop screen so it faced outward, toward the floor. Then she pressed print. To the communal printer that sat at the edge of the central space, the one everyone used, the one whose output tray was visible from every row. 53 pages came out, not a resignation letter, not a complaint, a manual. The complete, annotated, plain language operational guide to every system she had built, maintained or touched in 22 years. The archive taxonomy, with the logic of every category decision written out so that anyone, a person who had been there 11 months, person who had been there 11 days, a person with no prior records experience, could open the system and understand it. The cross-reference methodology she had developed for regulatory filings, documented step by step, with worked examples, the index of every index, the location of every backup, the naming convention for every folder explained from first principles, with the reasoning that had produced each convention, so that when the convention eventually became insufficient, which it would, she wrote, probably in 4 to 6 years, given the current rate of document accumulation. Whoever was there could adapt it intelligently rather than simply, doing what had always been done because it had always been done. 43 people got up from their desks. Not all at once. First, one person came to the printer to collect something unrelated and saw what was in the output tray and stood reading it. Then another person came. Then a third. Then people simply started moving toward the center of the room, the way a current moves, without anyone announcing it or organizing it. Just the movement of people toward something that was happening. By the time Nkechi had closed her laptop and picked up her bag and the pothos in its painted pot, there were 43 people standing in the space around the central tables. Not watching, standing, still. She did not give a speech. She had not planned to give a speech, and she did not give one. She looked at the faces she recognized. Toyin from Client Liaison, who had been there almost as long as she had, Emmanuel from I, who had fixed her machine 17 times in 12 years, and never once made her feel stupid for not knowing how to fix it herself, Funmi, who was 24 and had started in records 6 months ago, and whom Nkechi had already been quietly teaching the system because she could see Funmi understood things the first time, and she said, "The manual covers everything. Something is not in the manual. My personal number is on the last page. You can call." Funmi was crying. She was the only one. Keiichi picked up the pothos. She walked to the elevator. The door opened, and she stepped in, and the door closed. Downstairs, in the lobby, the security guard, a man named Mr. Biola, who had been at the front desk since 2006, and who had greeted her by name every single morning for 16 years, stood up from his chair when he saw her coming. He did not say anything. He simply stood up, which was something he did not do for everyone, which meant what it meant. She stopped at his desk. She looked at him. "You are leaving us," he said. "I am leaving the building," she said. That is not the same thing. She was right. What happened over the following 6 weeks happened the way consequential things often happen. Not dramatically, not in a single sudden event, but in the accumulation of small movements that produce an undeniable direction. Funmi, working from the manual Nkechi had left, discovered on her third day alone in the archive that 2 consecutive year-end compliance packages from 2019-2020 had been filed under an incorrect classification code, a code that placed them outside the automatic regulatory reporting window. It was not sabotage. It was almost certainly an error made by a temporary staff member during the period in 2020 when Nkechi had taken 4 weeks of compassionate leave following her mother's death. But it was the kind of error that, if not corrected before the next regulatory audit, would constitute a reportable breach under the Securities and Exchange Commission guidelines that Nkechi had cross-referenced into the manual in Section 7, Paragraph 3, with the relevant statutory reference. Funmi documented it precisely, in writing, time-stamped, the way she had been taught. She sent the documentation up the chain. The chain, lacking the person who had always managed this kind of complexity, did not know what to do with it. The documentation sat in 3 separate inboxes for 4 days before anyone acted. 2 floors above the archive, Toyin from Client Liaison had been trying for 3 years to find documentation supporting a disputed fee arrangement with one of the firm's oldest clients, a manufacturing concern whose account had been with Meridian since 1999, and whose founder, a man in his 80s who had known the original managing director personally, had been writing letters of complaint for 31 months. The file existed. Nkechi had always known it existed, and exactly where it was. But no one since Nkechi had been able to find it because the filing logic required understanding a cross-reference between the client's industry code and the archived fee schedule revision register, which was itself a document that did not appear in the main index because it predated the 2005 taxonomy restructure and lived under the pre-2005 naming convention that Nkechi had documented in Appendix B of the manual, footnote 4. On the 11th day after Nkechi left, Toyin opened Section 4 of the manual, followed the cross-reference logic step by step, found Appendix B, found footnote 4, located the file in 22 minutes. The dispute was resolved within a week. The founder's lawyer sent a letter. The letter went into the archive under the correct classification code. The call came from the firm's new general counsel, a woman named Adieze Ngozi Okafor, who had been appointed 4 months earlier, and who had spent most of those 4 months trying to understand why. Records Department produced the results it produced without anyone being able to explain the mechanism. She called Nkechi's personal number, which was as promised on the last page of the manual. Nkechi was at home when the call came. She was sitting at her kitchen table, eating ajaj bread and groundnut soup, and reading a novel she had been meaning to read since 2019 and had not the evenings for Kadimba, who was 14 now, and had her grandmother's laugh and her father's way of sitting very still when she was thinking, was doing homework at the other end of the table. Nkechi's phone rang, and she looked at the number, and she answered it. Adieze Ngozi Okafor did not waste time on preamble, which Nkechi appreciated. She said, "We have a compliance situation I need you to explain to me. Undocumented cross-reference system. I need you to walk someone through. And a question about your availability for a consulting engagement. Terms to be negotiated, starting as soon as possible. Are you available to come in this week?" Nkechi ate a piece of bread. She looked at her daughter, who was not looking up from her homework, but who had gone slightly still in the way she went slightly still when she was listening. "I'm available," Nkechi said, "but I have some conditions." The first condition was the one that surprised Adieze most. It was not about money, though the money was also discussed, and the figure Nkechi named was higher than the figure she had been paid as a full-time employee per day, which was appropriate. The first condition was this: Funmi was to be formally appointed as acting head of documentation. The full title, the full authority, and the full salary of the role, effective immediately and pending a formal review in 90 days, supervised by someone else, not reporting to someone in a parallel function, head, because the person most qualified to run the documentation system was the person who had spent the last 11 days proving she could learn it, because a 24-year-old who understood things the first time and wept in public when someone who had treated her with dignity was removed from the building was exactly the kind of person who should be in charge of something. Adieze said she would need to discuss it with the board. Nkechi said she was happy to wait. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds, then Adieze said, "Done." The second condition was that the manual became the official operational document of the Records Department. Not a courtesy document, not an advisory guide, but a mandatory reference with a formal review cycle built into it so that it would be updated by whoever held the role and never again allowed to exist only in a single person's head. Because Nkechi had spent 22 years being the person that everything lived inside of, she understood now what that had cost her and what it had cost the firm. Even if the firm had not understood the second part yet. The thing they took, Gerald Ease told the board, in the meeting 3 weeks later, where the full picture of the compliance situation was presented, was a system we didn't know we had because she had never failed to operate it. He was talking about a filing methodology. But the board, looking at the numbers, the 2 misclassified compliance packages, the disputed fee file finally resolved, the 11 cross-reference flags from 2007 and 2008 that the new general counsel had quietly requested Nkechi document formally as part of the consulting engagement, understood that he was talking about more than that. Gerald Adieze resigned in January. It was described in the internal announcement as a mutual decision. The announcement was filed in the company records under the correct classification code by Funmi Adeola, acting head of documentation, who had been confirmed in the permanent role 12 days before. What they tried to remove from Nkechi was a job title. What they didn't understand was that the job title was the least of what she carried. She carried 22 years of understanding, not just of documents, but of the gap between what a system is supposed to do and what it actually does when no one is paying careful attention. She carried the discipline of a woman whose father had taught her that the record is the truth written down and stored in two separate locations, cannot be erased by a man who prefers it to be blurry. You can be removed from a room. You cannot be removed from what you built in it. The system runs on because she designed it to run without her, which is the mark of someone who understood her own work well enough to let it outlast her presence. That is a particular kind of power, the kind that does not need to announce itself, because when it leaves the room changes. Some people spend their careers making themselves indispensable by keeping knowledge to themselves. Keiichi spent 22 years building something anyone could use, and the morning she left, she handed it over completely. The morning she handed it over completely was the morning everyone in that room understood what they had had. The ones who try to remove you from the building sometimes do not understand that the building is in you, not the other way around. Keiichi went home the Tuesday after her last day and sat in her kitchen with her daughter and a novel and a bowl of groundnut soup, and she was fine. She was more than fine. She had been preparing for this since the second time she was passed over, and possibly since long before that, because a woman who keeps records in two separate locations has already decided that one location might not be safe. She had been ready. They had not known she was ready, because people who keep careful records tend to keep that to themselves too. If you were let go from something you had built with 22 years of your life, on your last day you had the chance to do one thing before you walked out, what would you do? Would you walk quietly? Would you burn something down? Or would you leave a map? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.